this whimsical image, we see that our heroine, played by model Kelsey Barnwell, having fled the city, has removed her mask and is seeing her true self for the very first time. This image is a study in color harmony, mixed lighting, and HyperSync strobe synchronization. The job at hand was to create an eye-catching image of this fiery red dress for Vancouver fashion designer Sam Stringer. Sam made my job easier by sourcing Kelsey and the makeup artist Anna Maria Badilla, leaving me to supply the location, lighting, photography, and concept, which I did with the help of my publicist's wife, or is that wife publicist, Sylviane. Part of my concept was to contrast the vibrant red of this beautiful creation against a cold blue city skyline. The deep blue sky and its blue light reflecting on the Vancouver city skyscrapers would create wonderful color contrast to the dress. I wanted everything except the dress to appear cold in the image, so I processed the raw files with a bias to blue. In Lightroom, I set the color temperature to 3700 degrees Kelvin. Kelsey's fair skin with the additional blue balance was perfect. Fair skin tends towards blue, while darker flesh towards yellow. This really helped to lend a cold, ethereal look to the scene. For my perfect background, I needed the blue sky behind the camera to create a blue wash of light over the towers of the city. For this to work, it was necessary to pick the time of day when the sun starts to move behind the buildings. This would minimize direct sunlight on their front sides. Too much direct sunlight here would negate the cold blue look I was after. The biggest challenge on a shoot like this is shutter speed. I wanted to shoot wide open on the camera's aperture, so needed a really fast shutter, well above HyperSync speeds, if I was to get the background dark enough. That would make lighting the dress and the subject with strobe or flash difficult because working at high shutter speeds means you cannot sync with strobe or flash. Now you could work in the slower HyperSync range of shutter speeds by dropping to your lowest ISO setting, on my digital SR, 50 ISO. Then use neutral density filters in front of your lens, but typically you would need 4 to 6 stops worth, which makes focusing and viewing through the camera most trying. Fortunately, Pocket Wizard has a solution for me called HyperSync. HyperSync became an integral part of the shoot. First thing I did upon arrival at the shoot site was to finalize what I had in mind for the shoot with Sam. City. So that would give some light from the sky is going to come in, but it's going to be underexposed on her. And then this light's going to come across. And then I think it'd be kind of cool if we brought, if we put our light on this side. So let's say,
something to light both sides of her.
Yeah, because you know how you said let's do something with this rock.
Yeah.
So
we can get a wider stance.
Yeah, so something like this, maybe not as horsey as me, but yeah, exactly. And then coming in, and so she'll have the mask, and she's looking into the mirror.
Well, and then if we're in that pose, we could get a little bit of volume in the skirt, maybe get.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Windy.
So it looks like the wind is picking the skirt up,
yeah.
Give it that sort of flamenco kind of a look. Whenever possible, I like to rough in as much of the set as I can before the subject is brought in. That way I can do as much problem solving as possible beforehand, so that once they're in front of my camera, I can put most of my attention on them and less on the setup.
Where do you want me, right here?
Yeah, well, put one foot up on the rock, like, yeah, okay. And do like your arms out like that. I just want to see if I've got enough width here. Oh yeah, we're good. Yeah. That's a little, bring it down a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. That's fine. All right, so that's roughed in, but we can fine tune it once she's here. Since I figured I'd need to mix some strobe or flash lighting with available light, I prepped the camera by attaching a Pocket Wizard +3 radio flash triggering device to the camera's hot shoe. I like to see what I'm getting as the shoot progresses, so I almost always shoot tethered. To this end, I place my laptop right up next to my camera for easy access while shooting. Once in place, I plug one end of the USB cable into my camera, and then the other into my computer. Prior to bringing the subject in, I did a series of test shots to figure out what exposure on the background I would like best. For the background exposure, I first established that f4 was the aperture of choice since it provided the most shallow depth of field possible in the lens I was using. This shallow f4 depth of field would render the subject sharp while throwing the background out of focus, thus separating Kelsey out from the cityscape. f4 lets in a lot of light, and so I knew that I would need a fast shutter speed if I was to have the darker background I envisioned. Since I had made a decision on f4 for my aperture, all I needed to do was bracket the exposure of the cityscape with my shutter speed, starting with my fastest speed, 1/8,000th of a second. Then I shot it at a 1/4,000th, then again at a 2,000th, then at 1,000th, and then I finish off at 1/500th. Viewing these images in Lightroom, it took only a few seconds to figure out which shutter speed with f4 would give me the most dramatic city for my subject to contrast against. The image shot at 1/2000th of a second was close to perfect, but it was slightly darker than I wanted, and so I settled on a 1/1600th of a second as a perfect shutter speed to pair with f4. That's great, and if you want to give her the props there. So I'm just going to do a shot first without any lighting, just to see what we've got here. All right, so let's just get a quick meter, see what we got happening. Okay. 2.8 2,000ths. F1 and 4/10ths, 2,000ths. The sunlight striking Kelsey from behind read f2 point at a 2,000th of a second. The camera, however, was set to f4 at a 1/1600th of a second, making the sunlight exposure on the back edges of Kelsey 2/3 of a stop underexposed. But due to the back angle of the sunlight, this lighting looks brighter. It doesn't look so underexposed. This is because when the light comes from beyond 90 degrees from a camera angle, it appears much brighter than the incident meter suggests. While this works well for backlighting on Kelsey, why is it that her front looks so dark? The reason is that her front was lit not by direct sunlight from behind, but rather from light coming from the open sky in front of Kelsey. This frontal light, measured at Kelsey using an incident meter, read f1 at a 2,000th of a second. My camera setting of f4 at a 1/1600th of a second underexposes this light on the front of her by 3 2/3 stops. In other words, the open sky delivered low-level fill lighting to Kelsey's front, and the direct sunlight created bright backlighting on the back edges of her body, dress, and hair. Now, for argument's sake, here's another version of the image with the exposure set for the overhead open sky lighting, which correctly exposes Kelsey's front. In addition to being flat and boring, this exposure also grossly overexposes the back edges of the light on her and gives the city way more exposure than I want. So, the first image where Kelsey's front is too dark is really the exposure that I want for the back edge lighting and the city lighting. All this dark version of the image needs is to lighten up Kelsey's front by skimming some artificial light across the front of her. Skimming this light across Kelsey rather than directing it straight on will create the dramatic look I'm after. It will accentuate the folds, making the dress appear more rich, more deep in color and in depth. So to that end, I've attached a 61 by 91 centimeter, or that's 2 by 3 foot softbox, to a powerful studio strobe. I use the softbox rather than bare bulb because this light modifier softens the light quality, but at a cost. There is some loss of light. I picked this monoblock strobe for its power. 1,320 watt seconds, and for its slow flash duration of 1/300th of a second when at full power. Both important factors for using HyperSync, as you'll see further on. With HyperSync, you need lots of light from the strobe to compete with the sun. So to that end, I left out the inner diffusion baffle when setting up this softbox lighting modifier. To trigger the strobe, I attached a Pocket Wizard +3 to the light. Then plugged it into the strobe. Since the nearest AC outlet is a good kilometer from my light, I brought along a portable battery pack to power the strobe. I attached the straps of the battery's case to the bottom of the light stand so that the battery's heavy bulk could act as a sandbag. That way, if the wind blows, the battery should ensure that the light doesn't tip over. Once secured, the strobe's AC cord is plugged into the battery and the battery is powered on. Back at the camera, I direct the placement of this light source. If you want to bring that in, you see this sign here? There's about 2 knots wood down. You'll see the spot. Right about there. Good. Okay, so keep going, right about there. Slightly back to me. Okay, that's too much, just halfway in between. Okay, good. So let me take a look at that. More this way towards Kelsey. A little more, perfect. When I set my Sekonic meter to the 3rd from the left lightning bolt, then depress the Take a Reading button, it not only takes a reading, but it triggers the strobe by signaling the Pocket Wizard hooked up to the strobe. Isn't that just the greatest thing since chocolate truffles? How often do photo gear manufacturers cooperate like this? The other feature I love about this meter is this percentage value that shows up on the LCD screen. From the test fire I just did, it tells me that 80% of the exposure is from my strobe and 20% is from the ambient light. Exposure is one stop too bright. Let me read that. All right, thank you. Exposure is now perfect for my camera's f4 at a 1/1600th of a second exposure setting. Okay, and can you point your ground foot a little? Yeah, that's it. Just like that. That's perfect. Okay, this is looking great. Good, here goes. The reason why we don't see any of the strobe lighting on Kelsey is because I was shooting at a 1/1600th of a second. The camera shutter is unable to sync with the strobe flash at this shutter speed. The fastest it can handle is about a 200th of a second. Not a problem though, because I'm going to swap out the Pocket Wizard +3 on my camera with my Pocket Wizard Flex TT5. The Flex TT5 will manipulate the situation so that I can capture strobe lighting above X-Sync shutter speeds. The Pocket Wizard Flex TT5 is programmable, giving you the ability to manipulate the situation, making the capture of strobe lighting above X-Sync shutter speeds a reality. I can actually set it to create an offset that collects only the end portion of the strobe burst. This gradual trailing off portion of the burst occurs right after the strobe peaks. You are, of course, losing a lot of strobe power by emitting the peak. But since we're shooting with a fairly powerful strobe and with our camera aperture set wide open, we get more than enough light. So the imaging sensor receives light of more or less consistent brightness during the travel of the opening shutter blades, rather than an intense short light spike for a fraction of the exposure, followed by a comparatively dim trailing off of the light. To program the Flex TT5, I must connect it to my computer with a USB cable. This is a good argument for shooting tethered, since you can change the Flex TT5's offset on the fly rather than having to anticipate what you might need. To set my HyperSync offset, I first of all need to open the Pocket Wizard utility. First thing I'm going to do is tell it which camera that I want to use. And then we come over here to HyperSync. Turn these on. And now this is where I set the HyperSync offset. To know what number I want to set this to, I'm going to refer back to the little chart that I made after doing my test, figuring out the best offset for each shutter speed. So I know that I'm going to be shooting around 2,000ths of a second, so I'll select this number right here, minus 3,300. So that's the offset I'm going to type in to the Pocket Wizard utility. Press enter, and now it's done. Okay, all we have to do now is click here for Apply Changes. Click Yes. And now we're ready to go. I swapped out the Pocket Wizard +3 on my camera with my Pocket Wizard Flex TT5. The +3 on the main light, which is acting as a receiver, stays as it is. It receives perfectly well from the Flex TT5. For this to work though, the strobe must be set to full power. I remetered the subject to check the power change on the main light. The meter reads f14, which is too little. It needs to read f16. That sounds pretty high, but remember that the meter can only collect and read the burst of light from the strobe, whereas our shutter on the camera, which is being manipulated by the Pocket Wizard, is only going to collect the strobe light after the peak. This after peak light is the end portion of the burst, which is considerably more constant in brightness than the peak. It is, however, also much less bright. Now my camera is set to f4 for depth of field, so I will leave it alone and will either change the distance of the light or try feathering the light more directly onto the subject to get the exposure to read f16. So all this to say that if I want a correct exposure with the camera set to f4 while using HyperSync, then I need to have f16 amount of light striking my subject. I shot a test beforehand, which is basically a guide value test. I used trial and error to figure out what distance the strobe needs to be from the subject to create a perfect exposure at full power. Now, measuring the distances at the time of the shoot is cumbersome. So at the time of this test, once the right distance for the strobe was found, I took a meter reading to see what the meter would read. Even though this reading is not what my subject will expose as, I can use it as a correlation. After I found the perfect distance for the strobe to get a perfect strobe exposure on my subject with the camera set to f4 at a 1/1600th of a second at 100 ISO, I found that my light read almost f16. I then documented this correlation and then did the same for the other high-speed shutter speeds that I might need to HyperSync to. So, in my test, I observed a one-stop gain in strobe lighting with every one-stop decrease in shutter speed. Basically, if I want to shoot at f4 at a 1/1600th of a second, then I need to alter the strobe's distance from the subject until it read f16 on my Sekonic meter in incident mode. Now, my last meter reading of f14 showed that I'm almost there, so I have a choice. I could move the light a little closer, or I could try feathering it more directly onto the subject. So feather this way, right, a little more, right there, perfect. Okay, let me read that. All right, thank you. To calibrate this whole HyperSync system, I set the camera shutter to 160th of a second and took a shot. The strobe will not fire when you do this calibration shot. Now that's okay, that's what it's supposed to do. Once done though, remember to set the camera back to the shutter you want to shoot at, and now the strobe will trigger properly using HyperSync. So Sam, if you want to come in, you're on the dress. Okay, ready to go at my end anytime you're ready there. All right. Okay, that looks excellent. Just trying to get my focus point here, perfect. And tilt the mirror slightly to me, right there, that's perfect, just like that. And drop the dress. Nice one. And again, bring it in. Can I have the mask a little more into the sun, so turn it back that way? Yeah, perfect, that's good. Mirror's perfect. Tilt your head away from me just a little bit, great. And then really arch your back and pull right in. Yes, that's it, perfect, just like that. And drop the dress. In this final hero image, I've captured all the light just the way I want it. The strobe exposure is now properly recorded on the front of Kelsey while maintaining the subdued direct sunlight exposure as well as the overhead skylighting. Perfect. So by setting the strobe to the highest power to ensure the longest strobe duration possible, and then by tricking the whole system with an offset set on the Pocket Wizard Flex TT5, I'm able to use strobe lighting with super high shutter speeds that are beyond X-Sync speeds. This technique works best on strobes that take longer to dump their full charge of light onto the subject. The most suitable strobes are typically older and/or more powerful models. Older is better because newer designs tend to use more capacitors and so dump faster. Perfect for freezing action, but not a good thing for HyperSync. Also, those units that generate more light need more time to dump this charge onto the subject. So, in a nutshell, slower within reason is better. To review the setup for this image, let's take a look at a diagram of the setup. This sketch shows our subject posing about 1 kilometer from the cityscape background and with the camera placed 3.5 meters in front of her. The late day sun lights the back edges of the buildings and Kelsey, while the open sky lights their fronts. If I took a picture of this scene using only available light with my camera set to the incident meters reading of f4 at 1/160th of a second at 100 ISO, I would capture an image as you see it here that is correctly exposed but with flat, boring frontal lighting on the subject and city alike and with grossly overexposed backlighting on all. If I set the camera to f4 at 1/1600th of a second at 100 ISO, as you see here, I get the exposure that I want for the cityscape and for the edge lighting on Kelsey. But now Kelsey's front is underexposed by 3 6/10 stops. I need to artificially light her front. The addition of the battery-powered strobe fixed with a small softbox placed to the camera right-hand side of our subject and with the power set to full gives me an f16 incident meter reading of the strobe light striking Kelsey, which with the light loss from the HyperSync process creates a nice exposure on our subject with the camera set at f4 at 1/1600th of a second at 100 ISO. Placing the light to the side of Kelsey solves the flat-lit look. Because the light skims across the subject rather than striking straight on, subject shadows are pushed across her rather than behind. This makes for great texture in the dress and overall drama. Also take note that the shadows maintain some subtle detail thanks to the fill lighting of the open sky, which is drenching our scene in light, but at 3 6/10 under the camera setting. As you have seen, HyperSync with the amazing Pocket Wizard Flex TT5, or its more compact version called the Mini TT1, creates a wonderful solution to shooting with studio strobes at high shutter speed on location. The beauty of this system is you can use really powerful studio strobes. Your only limiting factor here is electricity. At present, with current battery packs available, you really can't power a strobe much more powerful than the strobe I used on this shoot. But if you plug into a wall socket or rent a good generator, you can go way beyond this power. I have a couple of old studio strobes from the late 1980s that pump out 4,800 watt seconds of light each. They HyperSync beautifully, but need a hefty generator or wall socket. So not as portable a solution as I used on this shot at Kelsey, but if you need the power, it can be done. And finally, I'd like to finish off by thanking Phil Braden of Mac Group and to Pocket Wizard for their support in making this video, and also Seconic Meters.